Morning, everyone. It's a delight to have the panel we have today. It's the first session we've ever run live on technology for responsible tourism, and it's, in a way, it's long overdue. I'm pleased that it's happening for the first time in Dubai. And one of the reasons for that is that Dubai has established a really amazing set of sustainability standards. And Dina, you're not going to have time to talk about all of them. I warn you, we have to let the other speakers have some time too. But there's a lot to be said about Dubai. What I'm going to do is ask each of the panelists an opening question, and I'll introduce them as we go through that, rather than go around and have a round of introductions now. But everybody will get their opportunity to talk a little about what they're doing. Then we'll have a conversation. And then at the end, each of the panelists will have a couple of minutes just to sum up and give their final messages. So without further ado, let me just remind the audience that there is an opportunity to put questions to the panel, which will come through on the chat to me, and I'll pick some of them out for discussion. But Dina, let's start with you. You're head of sustainability for Expo 2020. I've had the great pleasure of interviewing you, I think 4 times now, about different aspects of sustainability at the Expo. And those interviews are all available on demand at ATM, at the ATM show now. You can get them online, but they will also be going on to the WTM Global Hub. So plenty of opportunity to watch those at your leisure later. Dina, I wanted to ask you, why has sustainability been given such a high profile in the Expo? I mean, it seems to be it's higher than it's been at any previous Expo.
Thank you, Harold, and thank you for having me again. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with the panelists and with you again. Sustainability is very, very important. When the UAE went to bid for the Expo, they committed to having one of the most sustainable expos in history. And my job and my team's job is to translate that into objectives and actions. And so I think that it stemmed from the vision of the leadership. And I think the COVID crisis did not hinder that. It actually accelerated that. And I think we were chatting about this right before we came on live. And I absolutely agree. I think it accelerated our commitment from an Expo perspective to sustainability, but also from a UAE perspective. And I don't know if you saw the last few weeks, Dubai Tourism has come out and said that hotels have to follow the 19 sustainable requirements, and that they have to start reporting on those 19. Now, I think that that's a great move and a very important move for the city of Dubai, but also for the country of the UAE.
Dina, perhaps you and I can record another interview about that, or with someone else from Dubai Tourism. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because that reflects back on the conversation we were having before we went live this morning, which was about the progress being made in cities in America, in Europe, even in the UK. Big progress being made in cities. But Keith, can I come next to you? Because you're involved, you're the managing partner at Globally Great, and we've got an interview which again is available on demand with your colleague, Stephanie, taking us through the website. But I wonder if you could just put what you're doing at Globally Great into a broader context for our audience in terms of trying to encourage the development of sustainability solutions, and perhaps tell us something about how you got to this.
That would be a great pleasure, Harold, yes. Stephanie and I are both from very different backgrounds, and we both come to sustainability, I guess, quite late in our careers. Because we both believe it's really, really important that there's some significant change over the next decade, and we want to play a role in helping that change happen. So what we do at Globally is work with businesses to help them make change. We run a number of programs, but what we realized was that change, the scale of change that's needed in sustainability can only happen if there's a lot of innovation. Technical innovation particularly. And that's why we have this platform Globally Great, where we host videos from innovators, entrepreneurs from all over the world who are developing new technologies or evolving technologies that can help us all become more sustainable. Within the Middle East, we do a lot of work with businesses. We run various programs. And I mean, at the moment, we're working with about 100 different businesses to encourage them to take sustainable action this year, using new technologies, using well-established technologies, but we're very focused on getting businesses to take practical steps and practical action to make a real difference now.
Keith, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I want to try a line of argument and see whether you agree, and it'll be a great introduction to what Andrea's going to say, I think, or what I hope she's going to say. I'm aware that a lot of people, particularly in the very early days of, for example, photovoltaics, were sold systems which, when they were implemented, didn't deliver what they were led to believe they would deliver, and that has been one of the dampers on further innovation, the sense that, can you trust the salesman who's trying to sell you this particular piece of kit? And then the other part of the problem is that I think it's true that different kinds of kit work in different environments. It's not that surprising, but again, something which is often ignored. Do you think my understanding of that is correct?
Yes, I think that's very true, and I think that's why a lot of businesses are quite wary of being early adopters in technology. They would much rather, in many cases, see a technology well established in a different part of the world or in other similar companies before they adopt it themselves. And one of the things we like to do is build partnerships between innovations and businesses. We feel it's often, if we're looking at quite a new technology, important that the individuals within both sides, on the technology side and within the company that might be looking at adopting it, work together over a period of months to really understand how the technology might be able to help that company. The staff of that company really get to know the technologists behind it and build some strong personal relationships as much as anything else, so that if there are hiccups in the implementation of a very innovative solution, there's some goodwill to get through that.
Thanks, Keith. Andrea, you Green Tourism CEO, been around a very long time now, much longer than you might expect. You were one of the first into the field in Scotland. How do you see the rate of adoption of these green technologies? Do you share my perspective that at the beginning there was too much overselling of less than excellent kit?
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for the intro, Harold. Yeah, I agree that we started Green Tourism 25 years ago. During those 25 years, we've undertaken around about 20,000 assessments with businesses. We've certified over 5,000, and we currently have 2,500 businesses that we're working with across 20 different countries. And definitely in the early days, when technology was just starting, I mean, the early days, even low energy light bulbs weren't particularly available. So I think people have learned as bleeding edge technology has come along. And I think now we're finding that there is a lot more available, but there's still that sort of a challenge of businesses, especially when there aren't specialist installation and companies, technology companies available to give the right kind of advice. What we've done within our own process is we are a certification body, but we're also about giving advice and support, cross-pollinating ideas between businesses and suppliers. And we've engaged ourselves in a technology solution for that process. So before it was very much kind of a traditional certification process. You visit the business every 2-3 years, you give them a bit of advice for a couple of hours, and then you disappear. What we've done is we developed 2 years a green check platform, a portal that allows businesses to access the information immediately at their own pace, ongoing all the time. We've seen as a result of our own technology, something like a 700% increase in interest. So we have a little quiz on our website, which you can do, a green check quiz, which really increased the number of businesses that wanted to engage. We've had over a 500% increase in engagement with our certified businesses because everyone's technology driven these days. You're on your iPhone, you're on your tablet, you're on your PC. They want to get the information immediately, and I think that's really important. That's where technology is driving things. We are able to collect now much more data, quantitative data, qualitative data, and qualitative being some of the most important because you get to find out about people's problems, but also their stories, their achievements, all the great things they've done, which you can then share with people. It's improved motivation within the businesses considerably. Our portal allows multi-use logins, so they've now got more people within the company that can engage. So chef can come in, or the maintenance guy can come in. And what we've seen is a real change of motivation and speed at which people are putting changes in engaging new technologies, improving what they're doing. And in the past, we have 3 levels: bronze, silver and gold. And where we've seen people taking up to 6 years to move up the levels because of the way the assessment and the advice happened, people are now moving on in 6 months. So people are putting in place a lot of changes quickly because they're getting that one-to-one advice, they're getting that support. And that's where we've seen technology really engage. And as I said before we started the session, destinations is a big area of growth on the green recovery. We've seen a lot of that from cities, regions, protected areas, national parks. And more interesting, we're launching in a couple of weeks' time our green meetings standard, because that's a big demand that we get. So it's for meetings and events, and it's the industry that's come to us and said, we need some kind of certified badge of credibility, because that's what our buyers are looking for. So technology is helping in lots of ways, but that's how we've experienced it over the last couple of years.
So one of the ways of understanding the shift is that people are feeling much more empowered to actually understand what the technology is delivering, and that's across now multiple groups within a business. So it's not just the green team or the director responsible for greening the hotel who is taking responsibility. It's the whole.
It's empowering people. It's empowering, and it's throughout now the business rather than just being responsible on one person.
The other thing which I think I've seen change, certainly I think this is true of your organisation, but I think it's true of others as well, is more focused now on the outcome in terms of reporting rather than the process. So it's not how many LED light bulbs you've got, it's much more about what's your overall electricity consumption and how much of that is renewable. So it's actually simplifying the metric, accepting that still how you get to that lower metric is complex.
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
metric itself is a lot simpler rather than multiple counting. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's lots of technology out there that businesses can use to monitor. I mean, Eric was on yesterday on Greenview talking about, their portal. And, I think there's a lot of businesses and actually customers, especially the corporate customers, want defined information. They want clear information about what you're doing, whether it's carbon per bed night or carbon per meeting squared or a meeting report on the sustainability initiatives. And that's where our portal is going to be used to promote what businesses are doing. So there's transparency between the certification, the advice, and what the businesses are actually doing. I think that's crucial for the future.
Thanks, Andrea. Claire, we had Eric on the panel yesterday from Greenview, who you used to work with before you moved to the Sustainable Hospitality Alliance. And you've got quite a lot of experience now of what's happening both globally and in the UK. What's your sense of the speed of progress now? Is it more rapid than it was? And if it is more rapid, why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it is more rapid at the moment. We're seeing everyone have an understanding of how big a gap we have to kind of breach. So a couple of years back, the Alliance put out a report which said that as an industry, we need to reduce carbon by 90% by 2050. And obviously, we've seen a lot of companies come out of saying about net zero as well. Now, alongside that, you've got the fact that 80% of the buildings that will be here by 2050 are already here. So, it's not a case of, we can build lots of fantastic new buildings. We've got to think about how we're going to retrofit the ones that are already here. And one of our members, IHG, have actually just put out a report on making buildings that are here already carbon neutral, or zero carbon rather, and they've said that about 40% of that will have to come from the technology side of things, and that's installations, looking at solar, looking at renewable energy sources, looking at energy efficiency, and I think there is a big drive to try and get that right across the industry.
Are you as
But
depressed as I am, Claire, that we still see, it's not just hotels, let's be clear, but we're still seeing major buildings constructed without grey water recycling actually plumbed in, and we know that retrofitting that is particularly expensive. It's one thing to change your source of electricity supply and maybe increase the efficiency of the units which are using electricity within the building, but the water issue is, in those areas which suffer from water scarcity, a very big problem for retrofitting, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. It's the sort of thing that is the whole system needs to be put in at the start. And like you say, it's very difficult to retrofit. I personally would like to see kind of minimum standards of all new buildings that are going in should have particular aspects of sustainability, especially in water scarce areas where that is of particular concern.
One of the issues that came up yesterday in the conversation involving Eric was the challenge of how you get people to take it seriously when the financial reporting cycle for many of the big companies is so short, that the expectation is of quarterly results, and yet we know that sustainability will often pay off, sometimes quite quickly, but on some things 2, 3, 5, 10 years. People aren't necessarily still thinking those kinds of timescales, are they?
No, I think, when you start talking about 2030, 2050, it seems a very long time away. But when you look at the progress that we've made over the last 30 years, we really do need to ramp it up. And yeah, I think part of the issue comes down to who is paying for it. When you think about, getting those financial people involved, and if we can show them that they can get the paybacks within sort of 4 or 5 years, that is much more sort of tangible to them. But there's still the concern, Keith mentioned earlier about the fact that whether they're actually going to see the results that they're being told that they will.
There's nobody that's going to convince them more that they will see the results than somebody else with a similar kind of hotel, a similar kind of place, who has managed to deliver it. So we'll come back to some of those issues. Chris, you've waited very patiently for me to come to you. Chris is joining us from Australia, where I think it's a very different time of day. So thank you for being with us. Chris, you're doing something completely different, aren't you? And it picks up on the point Claire was making. I think, if I remember rightly, Claire, you just said that 40% of these gains were going to come through technology. And presumably it's changing behaviour, both staff and guest behaviour, which is going to contribute a large part of the saving. And in a way, Chris, that's been the main focus of your work over the last 5 years. Do you want to just briefly explain what you're doing and why you're doing it?
Well, what I'm doing is providing persuasive communication to encourage people to conserve resources. So our focus is on conserving. That's not about efficiency or technology. It's all about behaviour. I think the place that we start is to understand that buildings do not use any energy and water or waste anything. It's as soon as people get into the building that we then have the issues of consumption, overconsumption, and waste. So what we do is collect data in real time and provide that in a persuasive way to both the staff and the guests. So we try to encourage the staff improve their performance, and we improve guest satisfaction by showing them how they're progressing and ensuring that the work that people are doing to conserve is going to a worthy cause at the end of it. It's been very successful in the way we've progressed. It is different because people have, as Claire is saying, been focusing on technology. But, the reality is when you speak to engineers who have been working very hard at improving efficiency, they now accept that it's all down to behaviour. So this is the critical factor that we've got to fix. And if I can just go back to the points you made about the solar. Renewable energy has its drawbacks, and solar doesn't change behaviour. In fact, it can have the reverse and rebound because people feel that they can use as much as they want, or in fact backfire in the fact that people will use a great deal more, that they can just get more and more solar panels. So we need to be addressing this with behaviour factors, and we need to do it in a persuasive, positive way, which is what we've been doing.
Keith, do you recognise that in the businesses that you talk with?
Yes, very much so. I mean, I think there's key, certainly on the financial side. I mean, it's very, very important that the CFO, for example, is bought into what's going on in a business. I mean, people say, "Oh, the CEO needs to be engaged, needs to be supportive." That's not always the case. You can have a champion for adopting a new solution or a technology who's quite junior. Provided the CFO is prepared to sign off on the investment, it's quite likely to get done. So I think it's very much about going with technologies that resolve real world problems for companies, but at the same time have a payback that is within a reasonable 2, 3, 4 years. And that's very much what we focus on, is that sweet spot of financially, it's got to be financially sustainable. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Yes, it doesn't help.
And it's got to capture the imagination at the same time of someone in the business. So it has to do both of those things. Someone in the business or the customers of the business, they need to be able to say, yeah, get excited about it.
Claire, one of the members, this is before your time, so you may not know the particular case, and I'm not going to name the company on air. It would be unreasonable to do that. But one of your member companies in the Sustainable Hospitality Alliance was very interesting. I think it's about 5 years ago. There was a long debate about who would take responsibility for sustainability within the organisation. There was quite a battle between the engineers and human resources. And in the end, it ended up with human resources. And one of the reasons for that was the realization that staff turnover in hospitality can be quite an issue. And if you can get people engaged in feeling they're doing good for the planet and for the local community, it eases some of those staff turnover issues. And I think that's a very interesting aspect of it, Keith, that getting people to come together in an organization that understand why it's important to the whole organization. Though it's not just something the engineer is doing by twiddling the knobs down in the basement of the hotel, but it's something which is fundamental to the way the business works. That must surely help to spread sustainability and to speed up progress. Are you seeing that in other parts of your organisation, Claire?
Yeah, I think it's been understood very much that the human aspect of it is very important. I know we've seen in some hotels, they've installed, for example, a smart ventilation system in the kitchens, which is meant to reduce the energy use by something like 40%. And then the chef decides that it's getting too hot in there, so puts a pan of boiling water running constantly, which then, defeats the point and ends up actually using more energy. So there's definitely a very key point around training and making sure that when people come into an organisation, firstly, they understand that this is important to the organisation, they understand why, and also they understand what they can do. So kind of almost having tailored advice for different departments of the hotel, so they can understand exactly what they can do within their daily roles. And show that it's part of their role, not sort of a bolt-on piece that people can do.
I suspect, Chris, that part of it is about giving some degree of control and management and ownership of the issue, both to staff and to guests.
It is, but I think we got to also realise, as Claire mentioned earlier about the lack of progress over the recent decades, is that the carbon and energy literacy of the staff and the guests is low. People don't know really the impacts of what they're doing. So when I've mentioned about persuasive communications, and what Claire's mentioning about really as a social contract, is that we have to start to educate people as exactly what it is that we're expecting. And staff have got to understand that these are the procedures that they've got to comply with to work in that particular establishment. The problem that the hotels have is it's the great turnover of staff and the continuous training process that they require. And that's a problem. But if you also think in the same building, you've got a continuous turnover of guests. So it's not like your family home where you can start to introduce some policies that your family, if you're able to manage your family, will comply with. You've actually got a great transit point of staff and guests who are all unsynchronized, consuming in the ways that they've culturally been brought up, And so therefore we've got a fundamental problem that hotels actually sort of personify a global issue on a mega scale. To give you an example, you'll find that people from certain countries with high rainfall will use 6 times more water during their stay than guests from an arid area in Australia, for example. So there's major cultural change that's got to be processed, and you need to do it in a manner in hospitality to maintain that sense of luxury or enjoyment of the experience. You can't just put preachy signs out. It's got to be far more sophisticated, much more ambitious. And going back to Keith's point about money, I think one of the barriers that we face is that everything is still on an ROI based on a very crude calculation. And it doesn't, as we all know, include the environmental consequences that those actions are taking. And that's holding us back, and it's making it difficult to get more ambitious projects through.
How do you think the educational process is going to change, Chris? Because, I mean, when I was at school, which was obviously a very long time ago, I don't think ecology had been invented. It certainly wasn't part of the school curriculum. And I can remember photovoltaics coming in way after I'd left school and university. But there's a whole new generation of consumers, many of whom are traveling extensively, who've got a much higher level of literacy in these areas. I take your point about the lack of knowledge more generally in the communities, but there is more in younger people. Is that going to make a difference?
I'm not sure there is more in younger people. There's concern, but you and I will remember C&D. There was concern over certain issues then. We need to translate concern into action. And if you don't know the difference of the impacts between the choice of doing A or B, and you can't compare them, then you can't make a responsible decision. And that's the problem that we're facing. Where responsible technology can really score now is to make the invisible visible and to enable people to make better choices. It's a fundamental thing. So literacy, we don't need to be literate in the sense of being all Cambridge scientists on climate change, but we do need to know what the writing on the label. We do need to know the impacts of X and Y. People always talk about showers and thinking that they're saving water, which of course they are, but fundamentally they're saving energy because of the water to heat, so the energy to heat that water, which can be equal to the amount of energy that you use in their guest stay in their room. But you also, in a skyscraper, have got to move that water to that location and then process it. Now, all of that is not really discussed. We just talk about the fact we must save water. And even with your analogy of processing black water and so forth, there are consequences to all of that. So it's much more complex. But our job, and everybody here on this panel will be doing their share in the way, is expressing it and explaining it in a manner that people can easily digest and act upon. But it is a challenge. It's a super big challenge.
Dina, I think that brings us back, thanks Chris, I think that brings us back very neatly to your aspirations for the Dubai Expo. Because it seems to me that those aspirations with the Dubai Expo really operate at 2 levels, don't they? There was a really serious commitment made by the Emiratis in charge of the whole process that it would be a very sustainable expo. But you've taken, and I'm sure this was something that they wanted as well, there's a big educational opportunity given the millions of people who are going to visit the expo to bring some of these things alive. Do you want to say just something quite brief, because we could talk all morning about the sustainability pavilion at the expo, and I absolutely accept that there's sustainability across the whole of the expo. Let's take that as read. But the educational piece is really in the sustainability pavilion, isn't it? Do you want to just say something about that, Dina, to whet the appetites of the other people on this panel and the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. The Sustainability Pavilion is a representation of what we're trying to do at Expo from a sustainability perspective. It's a LEED Platinum building. It will be net zero post Expo, and the reason for that is because we still have a lot of people coming in and out of the building during the Expo, hence why we do not expect it to be net zero during the Expo. It has black water filtration using reed beds. It shows what you can do from an architecture perspective, from a design perspective, and how you can create something sustainable, but also absolutely beautiful. The actual sustainability pavilion will be a children's science museum post-Expo. And some of the things that we're looking at is how do we, I don't want to use the word educate, but I want to use the word inspire the visitors and the children coming through to do something, one thing, even if it's one thing, something right. And so as you walk through the halls of the pavilion, it takes you through different journeys that go under the forest and under the ocean. And it shows you, first of all, the beauty of it. And then you go into some dark areas where it shows you the impact of humans on the ocean or on the forests. And then it also takes you through this journey where you have to make certain choices. And if you did make those choices, what are the consequences? And then by the end towards the end, you're coming to an area whereby if your house was burning or if your house was going underwater, what would you take out? And that question is actually asked to the visitors, and the visitors then realize that actually nothing is important. You know, it's a very interesting way of interacting or inspiring, let's say, our visitors to really think through consumption, for example. And then all of this comes into this hall where we've called it the Hall of Future Values, and the Hall of Future Values has different innovations and technologies. Some of them we're using on site. For example, we're using the MindSphere technology on site with Siemens, one of our partners, and we're bringing the site's energy, waste, emissions, water to life and showing how this site is living and breathing and consuming. And so that's shown in the Hall of Future Values. It shows the old ways of pulling water out from wells, and it shows all of the different technologies from around the world, not just in the UAE, but from around the world, that are trying to solve these problems that we've just identified as you're going through that journey. So to me, I think we're looking at the word inspire. I think educate is wonderful, but inspiring somebody to take action is even more wonderful. And the other thing is, I think the Expo opens its doors on October 1st. And one of the things that I think will happen as we move through this year is that we're going to see that the post-COVID recovery will be a green renaissance. And that's what I'm calling it, a green renaissance. And that green renaissance has to be not just the likes of us here, doing the right thing and pushing for it, because we've been doing this for years and years and years, but only recently have we seen this uptake in what we're doing. But the green renaissance has to be, okay, these are real issues, and we've seen what a pandemic can do. How can we then look at climate change with the same lens and try to resolve it before it gets to the point where it is catastrophic? And I think us as people working in this space have the opportunity to capture that green renaissance and really make an inspiring difference.
One of the things that's interesting about the Welsh sustainability commitments is that they placed it all in terms of the welfare of the people of Wales. They put the focus back on what the benefits would be for people by adopting a more sustainable approach, and that's obviously across employment security and jobs in the future and health. So clearly there is a human gain in this, and we perhaps don't talk about that enough, do we, Dina?
I think we don't really. I think the human gain in the well-being or the wellness of the human being is very, very, very important. And we don't live in a vacuum as people. We live within this ecosystem, and this ecosystem is getting more and more and more fragile. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that if we give a message out, we also have to make sure that we do take the human element into it. And I think the way of doing it is through inspiration. I don't think people like to be told you're doing everything wrong. Or sometimes I think that Chris mentioned this, is go and save water, and they don't know how to do it. So they don't have the tools. They either don't have the tools, or they think that someone's talking down to them because they're saying, go save water. So how do we resolve that? It's to make it about the human element and then inspire. And I think that balance is what we're trying to do here. And again, we're not doing it in a vacuum. We're doing it with all the stakeholders, with all the people who are working with us on this massive project.
Justina, on that point specifically, we've had a question come through on the chat asking about whether sustainability is being communicated sufficiently in languages and in ways that communicate with the world's great ethnic and cultural and linguistic diversity. To which I think I know what the answer is, but what would be your answer to that question?
I think it, personally, I think it is. But at the same time, I think there's more to do. I don't think that it's being done enough. For us, and I'll talk from my perspective and from an Expo perspective, I think we are communicating it. I think that we're trying to also change the perception that this region or this area is not just about big buildings and focusing on, you know, big cars and luxury, but there's no harm in mixing that luxury with a focus on biodiversity and sustainability, because the roots of this country are based on sustainable roots. And that does not only focus on the environmental, but on the social aspects. And so you see that, you know, for example, the State of the Green Economy report that comes out every year about the UAE, how the economic value of sustainability is trying to be harnessed, and how that there are strategies in place right now for us to drive that economic value forward, and create new jobs, create new ways of bringing technology together. For example, one of the SMEs that we're using on site right now, we created our own operations document for the Expo, because we realized that looking at all of the different standards, that they don't quite all fit. And it's like putting a square peg into a round hole. So we created our own document, which we call the RISE document, to look at our supply chain and our operations. And then we're using an SME to take that and to automate that process and bring it to life. And we've seen an uptake. Once we automated it, it was quite easy for our stakeholders to use. And we just rolled it out a couple of weeks ago. And so that, again, communicating doesn't not necessarily just mean going out and saying we're good, we're great, but communicating with your stakeholders so that they can be part of the solution.
Claire, thanks very much, Dina. Claire, you've obviously got members in probably virtually every country in the world. How do they tackle the challenge of the linguistic and cultural differences between the places they operate their hotels in?
In general, they will try and translate things into a couple of different languages, but you know, there is, I guess, a limit as to how many languages they have the ability to translate into from a funding perspective. So they will generally do sort of maybe 6 to 8 languages, and they'll focus on things like Spanish and Arabic, and the ones that kind of cover off a range of countries. But I think there is still a lot of, I guess, issue in being able to translate into languages that, you know, they don't have as many hotels in that location. So from that point of view, they are lower priority. But, you know, potentially if all the hotels can come together, such as through the Alliance, and create something that, you know, we could use the mass of hotels in the different locations to kind of fund translations of things. But yeah, it's definitely an issue when you are thinking particularly about people like housekeepers or engineers who have a larger impact on the sustainability within a hotel, and they are generally people who, you know, might have just the local language and not have any other language available to them. So you do need to really think about that.
Brings us back to Chris's point about the training. The other thing that occurs to me is that we talk about sustainability in this very abstract language, and yet in hospitality particularly, but it's also true, I think, of car hire, many people will experience some of these new technologies for the first time when they're away on holiday. I mean, I still remember the first time I stepped into an aerated shower, thinking just how amazing that was with all the power of the shower, and then looking down and seeing very little water in the tray, and suddenly realizing I ought to do that at home as well, because I'd be having a much better shower experience every day. And I don't think we should ignore that. It's part of the excitement of learning something new while you're away, and then bringing that back and perhaps looking at the way in which you run your own household. But can we move on perhaps to this question, Dina, that in a way was sparked by your comment about Dubai earlier, which to my shame I didn't know about. Otherwise I would have made sure I did before we got to this interview. One of the things which came up yesterday in the panel was my frustration that when I was going to travel to Cape Town during the drought 2 years ago, people were asking me where they could stay, and I couldn't find out which hotels were doing most about water. Now, it seems to me that I've known for a while that Dubai has been collecting this information from all the hotels in Dubai. It seems to me that the only place that's going to empower consumers to make these decisions, given that they're going to go to a place and are looking to book a hotel there, is going to be some kind of destination management organization. I don't know if you just want to comment briefly on that, Dina, and I'd like to come to you, Andrea, because you've been talking about it in Scotland.
So I think that Dubai Tourism Authority has been doing a great job at that. Yes, they've been collecting the information, but they just made the announcements, and they're going to be doing a lot of training. I actually spoke to them. We've been going back and forth. We know what the 19 requirements are like. They weren't created in a vacuum, and they are very much tailored, and that's why I keep repeating the word tailored, because the problem is it's not one size fits all to the region, and to create that growth in the region from an economic, environmental and social perspective. And so I think there's more to come, and I think it's a good space to watch as we go through the next year or so, and using Expo as let's say the way, an opening to this new era.
Well, see that grabbing the world stage
Exactly.
would be quite a motivator. But I imagine, Andrea, that that's partly why it's happening in Scotland too, because with COP26 coming to Scotland, presumably the cities are feeling a bit of pressure to demonstrate that they're making progress.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, and an interesting conversation. I really get the whole kind of inspire that Dina was talking about, and definitely Chris was talking about, like behavioural change, and we use the word emotion, that, you know, unless you get an emotional connection with things, that things just don't change, which is a shame, because I agree with Keith, we all need the CFO to be there saying, you know, we need the money to actually provide this technology. I think the challenge is even in the UK is that people often don't know how much they're using, and actually when they look at all of their other figures, that's the bit that they say, well, that's not important, because it's actually how many people have we got coming, how much are they paying a bed night, how much are we getting in the bar and the restaurant, and they don't look at actually how much it's costing them to facilitate and provide all of that. The cities, the destinations in the UK that are interested are looking at it not just as a reporting on utilities and resource use. And you and I have had this conversation many times, Harold, is that I don't think that customers will go out and look to choose a hotel just because it's using less water. It will look at it in the round about all the other things they're doing. And I think where we take this process and the approach is that if we can get that emotional connection, if we can get the organization, the company, the destination to really buy into sustainability as a whole, then you can start influencing in, well, you need to change this and you need to change that, and reporting, providing that transparent information for the visitors and the guests. And I would say what we're seeing, especially from the meetings point of view, it's being driven by the corporates who want to see these these statistics. They want to see these evidence because they need to report in their own ESG reports that that's what we're doing. And it will filter down to others. But I think the emotional connection is important. I think getting people to actually just start their green journey, to get involved, to do things, that's when you can start influencing. And where certification comes in is that you can then start driving that, like they are doing in Dubai, around having standards that say, in order to get any kind of marketing or any kind of promotion, you've got to meet these minimum standards. And that's what will drive it. And then reporting on it so that it's transparent to the customer.
Keith, do you have a perspective on this? Do you see this happening in other places?
Yeah, actually, I think it would be amazing for customers to be given the choice of selecting green hotels. But I mean, a lot of the activity at the moment is back of house. The corporation is collecting data, they're managing things, they're using that to inform their own decisions. But it's very rarely that I, as a consumer, see that coming out in my experience. I think one of the most interesting and exciting developments that I've seen in the last few months in terms of sustainability was Google's announcement that they're changing their algorithm in North America to give people the choice of, rather than selecting the quickest or shortest route, selecting the route that's most environmentally friendly. And that sort of empowerment of consumers is really what needs to happen if we're going to see the sort of wholesale change that we need this decade. So it's very much, someone mentioned the aggregators coming online in terms of giving people more transparency about what the hotels are doing in terms of sustainability. And I think that would be incredibly empowering to people, and it will then drive a much more rapid change among the corporations themselves.
Well, thanks, Keith. When we were looking at South Africa, particularly Cape Town, and they were looking to introduce their responsible tourism policies in the city, one of the questions was, what are the priorities in Cape Town? And that raises immediately the very interesting question, should those priorities be set by elected city councillors or by the tourism industry? And the lobby for saying that the tourism industry should decide what those priorities should be was incredibly strong. But it does seem to me, and Andrea, you and I have debated this a lot, but in a particular context where there's a drought, it's quite clear that consumers are quite likely to be interested in it. They may not be interested in it now because there isn't a drought, but when there is a drought, it's the kind of thing that is front of mind, and people want to get that information. And it seems to be the only people who can make sure that's available are the destination managers, and that effectively means the city governments. And I think that's a really productive way forward if it begins to happen. Chris, you run a small business, well, a significant size small resort in Crystal Meadows in Kangaroo Valley, if I remember rightly, in Australia. And you must have competitors in that valley. Never talked to you about this before, but you must have competitors.
Yes.
Do you think your environmental track record helps your marketing or not?
I think that the truth of it is that the public don't spend a lot of time looking for accommodation or their holidays. Let me rephrase that. When they're looking for holidays, they will scan a lot of places, but there isn't a lot of time to make a decision. And if they're looking at short stays, even shorter. So they look after their critical needs, which is bedding configuration, location, and so forth. The environmental factors are something that they enjoy when they arrive. It's not something that they're necessarily going to expect. But what it's done for us is to allow us to put up our prices and to, significantly increase our visitation. So at the same time as asking guests to reduce consumption by 20%, which they actually do at a higher level, I've also put the prices up by over 10%. And I've got an increase in guest reviews, all positive, which has propelled us to be ranked as second in Australia for our category. So I think that there's this big argument about, is green a marketing advantage? It is at the right moment, but people don't have a great deal of time in making those decisions at the beginning. I think that what I've taken out of this session, which I thought was particularly relevant for responsible technology is what Dina was talking about as inspire, and Andrea is talking about in terms of the cultural factors and the emotion. And I think that if we're to put it all into context, responsible technology is about informing and encouraging people in an aspirational, motivating way, rather than the way we see technology today, which is rather a cold and data-driven service. We need to be moving far more to engaging people in gamification and responsibility in that way.
But one of the frustrations for me, I won't recount the whole story, I've told it so often, that when you go into a hotel and they've set the air conditioning down at 15 degrees and it's 32 or 33 outside, that's going to have an extremely negative impact on my health. So in a sense, empowering the consumer to be able to look after their own health by being able to move the temperature in their own room and not have that overridden by housekeeping coming in is clearly very important to people who expect to have more control over their local environment.
That absolutely. The whole focus that what we do, the whole focus is on the guest benefit. So in other words, saving resources has actually been using the amenities better for your health, for your well-being, for your comfort. And you'll see in many situations, I mean, the ideal temperature to sleep at is 18 degrees, but you'll find many properties will be, overheating the corridors or cooling the corridors to levels that aren't suitable for the public, and they have to then adjust it with their room temperature using the AC. That's in a hotel, but it's generally very poorly managed from that side. So we're all about, as they've said, in motion and inspire, it's about giving people the right information in the right way so they can see it's a better decision. So it's not moving to undertake things in a standard routine that we've mentioned about how chefs might be behaving and so on, but it's getting to stop and to think this is a better way of doing something. And that does require education, but in the right way.
Thanks, Chris. We're into the closing 10 minutes now of this session. So Dina, can I come back to you and just ask, reflecting on what others have said and what you've been thinking about over the last few years, what do you think the priorities are for immediate action by people responsible for sustainability in tourism?
I think the priorities are, I love what Chris just said, is that the whole emotions, as well, of course, as inspire and to create that educational piece. I think the priorities is to get the visitor or who's coming on board, but in a way that makes them feel as they're part of it. And I'll give you an example of that. And I should have actually mentioned that before. So we measure our carbon footprint. It's in our sustainability report, which you'll find on our website to create transparency. And we actually measure it on an incremental basis, looking at it towards a baseline. And reduce, of course, our carbon emissions and so on and so forth, using not just the design and construction, but also our efficiency in the operations. And that's all put together in our sustainability reports. But we've come up with a different way of inspiring the visitors to help us offset. And the way that we're doing it is we are allowing the visitor to choose which projects we will offset on, and gamifying the idea of offsetting, using the Expo app as a tool of doing that. So we've created.
Consumer engagement is at the heart of getting the change.
Exactly. So the visitor will be able to. There's a list of projects, and as you walk through the site, you gain certain points and do certain things. I don't want to give too much away, but then you have the ability to swipe a seed or give a seed, and that seed is worth a certain tonnage. In the background, those seeds are then tallied up, and then we will be giving our offset, let's say, budget towards the projects. That allows the visitor to be involved in the way that we offset and in the way that we are looking at carbon.
Thanks very much, Dina. I must say that wouldn't engage me at all, but I take the point. The world is full of diverse people. Keith, what would you say? You've got 2 minutes. What would you want to say if you've got a 2-minute elevator pitch for why people should just get on and do it?
I think, this really for me is the decade when we all need to take action as both consumers and as businesses. We need to get on and make things, make a difference. And we've been talking a lot about technology. There are so many new technologies available now that were not available 5 years ago, that are economically viable, that really can make a big difference to whether it be hotels or other businesses. Often these technologies work just as well in hotels as they do in factories, as they do in offices. We need to get on and investigate them and adopt them.
Thanks, Keith. That was a very clear pitch. Claire, you got slightly less than 2 minutes now.
Yeah, I think one of the key things is to really look at the business case, and I think there's been a lot of discussion about that today. We've got a business case document on our website as well, which kind of explains that, which hopefully gets to kind of the financial side of things. But I would agree with what everyone else has said today as well about really getting to, I guess, the hearts of people and thinking about that. And with that, I think it's very much linking the environmental and the social side of things, and thinking about how responsible technology can help with that as well. So human rights training, how that comes in, labour supply, when you're looking at that, how you can really use technology to be more sustainable there, and kind of wrapping up the whole of the responsible idea, really.
One of your members, Demetrius, yesterday on the panel was very open in saying he'd come under enormous pressure from his children to improve his own personal environmental performance, and that had gone over into his work as well. Andrea, in slightly less than 2 minutes, if you would.
Well, I think there's two areas. I think it needs to be top down. I think there needs to be changes in legislation, needs to be changes in education of architects, building designers, retrofitting. I think that technology needs to be built into the process, and I think that's coming, but I think it needs to be higher. And I think with the net zero and the targets that everyone has worldwide, but even also nationally and internet, that needs to be done. But I think from bottom up to drive the businesses themselves, the individuals within the businesses to do more, but also the consumers, that's where the emotional connection comes in. And ultimately, that transparency side of thing will be driven by what customers expect to see.
Thanks, Andrea. Chris.
How many minutes do I have, Harold?
2.
Okay. Well, I think the thing is that the difference between responsible technology and irresponsible technology fundamentally is the way that we use it, our behavior. And the best way to encourage people to take responsible action with that technology, the way they use things, is through persuasive communication, which is what we provide. And it needs to be gamified. We've already discussed today different languages and cultures. Gamification is a key way of involving everybody, and everybody has to conserve. We all need to conserve together, from top down, sideways.
Andrea, I'm very taken. Thanks very much, Chris. Andrea, I'm very taken with your point about the need for more regulation. I think one of the things that frustrates me about this field is that we still, in the UN system, they talk about sustainable consumption and production, forgetting that production determines the choices I can make as a consumer. The emphasis really ought to have been much more on what's presented to the consumer in terms of the choices they make. And that element, I think, in the past has been really quite weak. But I think there's also a connection with what was being said about the importance of local circumstances. And that's where I suspect city government has the bigger role to play, because it will be cities that say, here, the big issue is, well, let me take my own personal example, because I seem to be having more time than I thought I got. But to take my own personal example, I live in a part of Kent that's really water scarce. It's got serious water supply problems. So hotels here, I hope, would put water near the top of their priorities for saving it. My sister lives in North Wales, where they have another but very different problem with water. They have too much of it. And it doesn't, Chris, need to be pumped very far. You know, the reality is that they're in an area of low wage employment, putting more work into improving labour conditions would probably pay off better in terms of the total sustainability of that community rather than putting water at the top of the list. And I think that's where the cities really can have the impact in terms of determining what is locally significant, locally important.
Harold, can I give my example? In Edinburgh, they've got a commitment to net zero carbon by 2030, and we're already seeing the council start to talk about planning changes that are different from the national planning regulations in terms of retrofitting and actually banning certain types of heating systems in domestic and commercial buildings. And I think that with those kind of targets and commitment, that will happen.
So we have the same in Sydney. The city of Sydney is showing leadership and striving for net zero in 2035, and leading a destination program that really is excellent and won awards.
We need national government, certainly in England. In some ways, you're lucky to live in Scotland, Andrea. In England, the planning policies are much more centrally controlled. To enable the cities to have more influence, we're going to have to see a disempowerment of central government and increased power at the local level, I think, set local priorities. Our time is up. Can I thank you all very much for your participation in the panel this morning? I've enjoyed it enormously. I hope you have as well, and I hope that our audience feels that they got answers to their questions. It will, I'm sure this will become a standard feature of what we now do with the Responsible Tourism Programme, and I think it's a useful thing to have come out of this first session, that we need to look particularly at human behaviour. It's both about the nature of the choices consumers are given and then educating them to make the right choices. We need to make sure that we focus on both. But thank you very much indeed for your contribution to this panel. Thank you.